What's going on, everyone? This is Abby Martin with the Empire Files live, baby. It's been a while.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we had some technical difficulties with our microphones, but I think we figured it out. Thanks for joining us on a Tuesday night. For everyone who's not on the West Coast, we appreciate you joining us so late. Hopefully the stream will be up for the next 24 hours at least, so you can check it out if you don't make the whole thing. And hopefully you've been able to check out some of our stuff recently. We've had a lot of good stuff up on Empire Files, but we haven't done a live stream in quite a while, Mike. Why have we not done that?
Because we had a little baby, and actually 15 months ago we had a little baby, and which makes it increasingly difficult to do live streams because you can only do it after they go to bed, which only until recently what didn't even last very long once they went to bed. So now they are sleeping through the night, and now we have new capacity to do live streams again.
Yeah, and we hope to do it more. We have a great guy, Dan Simpson, helping us out with our live stream today. That's why it looks so pimp.
Thank you, Dan. Behind the scenes at the control board. Appreciate you. You'll see him at the end.
And we've been plugging along. We've been putting up some stuff, not as much as we had hoped. We're working on like 6 different videos right now. It seems very hard with childcare to do it all, but you guys should really check out our recent stuff, especially the CIA Stories series that we put out, including the interview with Raul Capote. He's a double agent who was working for the CIA and basically foiled like a 15-year-long plan in Cuba, I may add. Really incredible story, really incredible interview with this guy. He was basically the Juan Guaido of Cuba that the CIA was going to handpick to be the president. Just absolutely insane stuff. So definitely check that out on the Empire Files. And we have a lot of stuff on Cuba. We're working on a video right now about all the CIA operations in Cuba, but we have also a podcast up. So definitely check out SoundCloud and all of your podcast platforms to check out Empire Files podcasts. Because even though we're not putting up as much video content as we would like, we still have the podcasts continuing, including an interview with the organizers of the Zim weapon shipments blockade, the Israeli ship, the cargo ship that was blocked and basically did not dock on any of the U.S. ports. So that's incredible. It's a really incredible just explanation of how to do direct action and how these movements are built and can, when we fight, we can win. We have another one on the Ben & Jerry's, the inner struggle with the Ben & Jerry's fiasco.
A little drama in that one. We had, if you follow our podcast, you may have seen that we posted the episode and then promptly removed it. And that's because apparently someone on the Ben & Jerry's board was not happy about the episode. And so in the interest of not messing up their current plans of, continuing the boycott, like actually getting out of Israel, we took it down. But we are reviewing whether or not we're going to be putting it back up soon, which will probably just be for patrons. So join us on Patreon if you want to get that up.
Yeah, join us on Patreon. We're definitely going to be putting it up probably tomorrow or the next day on Patreon. But it's a really incredible story. And if people haven't been following it, they think that they were just divesting from the West Bank. And I was, like, okay, that's pretty much a cop out. How could you just divest from the West Bank if you're this, corporation with ostensibly like this progressive veneer and all this? But turns out the independent board is pursuing divesting from the entire country of Israel. So it's actually huge, and it will set a monumental precedent with the BDS struggle moving forward. So definitely follow our Patreon, check it out. It's an incredible story with a lot of nuances. We also put together, an episode on the death squads in Afghanistan that preceded the occupation, will surely outlive the occupation. And, we've done so much on Afghanistan, Mike, that I guess we didn't feel the urgency to really weigh in as all of a sudden everyone and their mama had, an opinion on what was going on. We had done this extensive documentary a year ago now, about a 30-minute short documentary on our channel that people can watch. And also, Mike, you've been giving tons of interviews about Afghanistan after, the troops were finally withdrawn and all this chaos ensued. So yeah, we felt like, after the dust had cleared, I guess it's not really true because it's still completely insane there.
Still clearing.
Still clearing. But we felt like we wanted to weigh in now after we kind of saw all the hot takes and all the media coverage and, to give our 2 cents, especially since we've done so much coverage on it. And I feel like we were kind of vindicated, Mike, because we, from the onset, knew that it was an actual withdrawal. We really did call that. And a lot of people were like, no, like the private contractors and stuff. And even though I understand that perspective, we definitely were calling it from the get-go that this was a withdrawal and that this was basically the defeat of the U.S. empire there.
Yeah, I think when the withdrawal was announced by Biden, early in his term, I think understandably the knee-jerk was, well, this is just a ruse. They're not really going to withdraw. They're going to replace the troops with mercenaries. There's still going to be other NATO forces there. There's still going to be, and there was a plan for a long time to have several hundred, maybe a couple thousand U.S. troops that are just in the embassy or just in the Kabul green zone, that the U.S. was, supposedly going to continue bombing. And so I think the main reaction, which is understandable, is the Afghanistan war isn't really ending. The U.S. is just changing the face of it to make it seem like it was going to end. And if you go back to our video that we published with Abby about the Afghanistan retreat, we basically made the counter argument that we understand why people would assume that the war is not really ending, but here's why it actually is. Like, the U.S. actually is defeated. The troops aren't going to be replaced with mercenaries because, what are 1,000 Blackwater mercenaries going to do in a country that's completely controlled by the Taliban, which in that video, that was kind of our assessment about what was going to happen. So, just good for the record that we were, tracking on it early on, that there were. And also, of course, the U.S. bombing has ended. I mean, that's why the Taliban were able to walk into Kabul and most other city capitals, just walking in, not having to fire a shot. Normally, I mean, they didn't do that before for the past 20 years because they would just be relentlessly bombed by the U.S. There were a couple residual bombings leading up to the full takeover of the country. Like, Biden used a B-52 bomber to, in Kunduz and killed, 20 civilians, a lot of women and children. There was a school that was bombed, a hospital that was bombed, the final war crimes of the war to put on the, the list of charges at The Hague. And that was really just to prevent the Taliban from taking over the city for like 5 more days or something. But that shows but then after that point, the bombing pretty much stopped and the U.S. and the Taliban was able to kind of walk in everything. So we're going to get into some of those details about what happened. But I think we can say now that the defeat has happened. And we're going to go into some details of that before we get into our main topic, illustrating how deep the defeat actually is. And despite the kind of desire for some in the establishment to keep it going endlessly, they kind of were stuck without a choice, really. And now they definitely don't have a choice.
Yeah, and I mean, you can argue that it's been such a stark defeat for so long and that the U.S. has been retreating for over a decade. But the air cover and the air support that the U.S. was giving to the Afghan security forces was really just continuing, prolonging the inevitable, right? 20 years of needless occupation, this brutal savagery unleashed by the U.S. and its allies. And there was always this conventional wisdom that this war was the good war, going to the Obama thing, like this was the good war, Iraq was the bad war, perfectly reasonable retaliation for 9/11. And it wasn't until like the last presidential campaign that I even heard a politician say, like, I was wrong. Like when Bernie Sanders was just like, you know what, Barbara Lee was actually right. I was wrong. I regret my vote. And, it does need to be said that the Taliban was trying to avoid this military incursion for so long. They tried several times to hand over bin Laden. They even tried to recognize the Karzai government. They did so much, right? But Bush negated all of the calls and, of course, invaded. And so here we are today where, 20 years later, Biden has finally followed through on his announcement to end combat operations. And according to AP, Mike, he is sticking to the deadline. He is sticking to this August 31st deadline, despite the complete hysterical reaction over what's happening now. I mean,
yeah, and if we could show that headline, Dan, because get it up there, and then I can talk about it. Okay, so so there has been a lot of pressure on Biden to not stick to the August 31st deadline. And here's why it's different than the pressure on Trump to not withdraw troops when he was in office. When Trump came in and we talked about this in our documentary, Afghanistan War Exposed, an Imperial Conspiracy. Trump kind of came in on all this rhetoric of get out of Afghanistan. There's that video where he's like at his desk, where he ate the big Taco Bell taco. And he's like, what are you doing? Get out of Afghanistan, And then he comes in, and even as he's negotiating, he wants to be the president that ends the war in Afghanistan, right? But then he received a lot of pressure. And then he caved to the pressure and then kicked the can over to the Biden administration. Unless he, would have won re-election, he would have been stuck with that decision. Then he's actually come out and said he wouldn't be doing it in this way at all. So maybe he would have been extending it. But there was a lot of pressure on Trump to kind of drag out this withdrawal deadline. So there's always a chance to revamp it. The pressure from Trump was predominantly coming from the Pentagon. The Pentagon generals saying, this isn't going to happen. And so he kind of caved to the pressure of the war makers being like, oh, well, you're the generals, I'll do whatever you say. But the pressure on Biden, and there's an enormous amount of pressure on Biden to delay the withdrawal deadline. So why did he stick to it and say August 31st, we're sticking to it? It's because he's not receiving pressure from the Pentagon now. In fact, he's receiving support and urging from the Pentagon to stick to the deadline. The pressure he's receiving is from other Democrats and, of course, Republicans that are so angry that a war is ending because their interests are more like with the military-industrial complex. There's even two Congress people. Both of them are Iraq vets. Seth Moulton is one of them, and this other guy is Republican. I don't know who he is, but they took an unauthorized trips to Kabul to oversee the evacuation of the civilians, against the wishes of one of them's a Democrat, one's a Republican. So there's all these dissenting voices that are we shouldn't be leaving, that are kind of rushing back. And so, Trump caved to the pressure of the Pentagon. Biden acquiesced to the wishes of the Pentagon. And so this is, what we're seeing now is the Pentagon's plan. The Pentagon wants to close the chapter of Afghanistan. And I have a lot of contacts who are in the military still. And I've been asking them, some are in special operations and stuff. And I've been asking them, what is the mood? What is the mood about Afghanistan right now? And they're all just saying, oh, it's all about China now. Everyone's mad that it's ending because, there's more deployments to go on. Certain people are into, but all the shift strategically training everything has now focused to a war with China. So that gives a little window into why the Pentagon is, happy to close this chapter after 20 years. A lot of money was made. A lot of people got promotions. A lot of officers got medals, built their careers off it, going into the defense industry now, making six figures or more. And they're happy to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, but why is it that the generals all of a sudden flipped when Biden got into power? I mean, if they were pressuring Trump to stay and then all of a sudden they're saying, no, we need to leave. How do you explain that?
Well, they still wanted to leave under Trump, but they wanted this time frame to be able to leave. And they still botched that. I mean, we can talk about how they also screwed that up because they just were so arrogant that they thought their puppet forces would last, maybe a year or a couple of years or something, instead of they didn't last the weekend. But, ultimately they wanted to leave. And if you really followed news about Afghanistan, especially ever since the Afghanistan papers came out in 2019. I mean, after that, that was really a nail in the coffin because the Afghanistan papers showed that all of the generals, the ones that want to go into these high-paying jobs in academia, think tanks, the defense industry, board of directors at banks, stuff all the things that Pentagon generals go into, that just the Afghanistan papers basically blew the lid and said they've all just been lying and just making shit up. And so it was kind of hard to go back from that. And then once that came out, it was the war was clear. There was no possible way they could reverse any of the Taliban momentum. The war was completely lost. They were kind of collectively as a leadership were disgraced as kind of being exposed for just lying about the war and everything. So it was, it became inconvenient. It was very convenient for them to wage the war for 20 years because they're not getting hurt. They're just sitting back in a command center. And so it started to become inconvenient when the retreat was in its, this was a slow motion retreat for like 12 years. The U.S. knew it was leaving and slowly retreated over a period of like 12 years, taking countless more lives on the way. And then as soon as it became a little inconvenient, they're like, okay, we can move on to something else, move on to the next war.
Yeah, I mean, the Taliban walking into Kabul over like a 3-day weekend after they were like, well, this isn't going to happen. And I mean, Blinken infamously said, like, it's not like this is going to happen in 3 days in terms of the Taliban taking over the country. And it essentially did, walking into Kabul, not even firing a shot, completely taking over the country. The puppet regime fleeing with tens of millions of dollars, completely collapsing. Let's give a quick, let's just quickly go over what was lost, right? I mean, $2 trillion later, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. The tens of thousands of lives is a gross underestimate. The Taliban is now fully in control, right? Just like it was before 9/11. The IMF, which is fascinating, even though it probably is not surprising, they announced that they are suspending Afghanistan's access to its own resources because of a lack of clarity of legitimate control of the country. Just unbelievable that the IMF feels like it has the right to do that, but I guess you can't say that you're surprised on that. Tens of thousands of bombs were dropped. Afghanistan was the most drone-bombed country in the world. I said hundreds of thousands. Yeah, 250,000 dead in Afghanistan and its neighbor Pakistan, which, again, could be much higher. And I just want to talk about two quick things that I felt like did not get enough attention over the course of this war. And they both relate to WikiLeaks. Two massacres that actually WikiLeaks was supposed to release. One of them they had a video of that was actually destroyed internally by a member of WikiLeaks, the Guarani massacre, where a B-1 bomber on May 4th, 2009, killed up to 147 Afghan civilians, mostly women and children. This is just shocking. I mean, it was part of the Manning war logs, the Afghan war logs, and again, it was destroyed before we saw that video. But it's just surreal to think about if we had that video and it was comparable to the collateral murder video, what would that have done to generate outrage from the American people to actually see a massacre like that instead of it just be this abstract thing?
What do you mean it was destroyed?
A member of WikiLeaks who was like probably like an agent working there actually destroyed the video. Yeah, and it never got out. Julian Assange has talked about this extensively. Yeah, it's pretty crazy and it's really fucked up, I'll
tell you, it's probably worse than the collateral murder video. Because 147 people instead of like 12 people probably would have a bigger impact on people's psyche.
Yeah, I mean, imagine what that would have done to generate an actual robust anti-war movement to try to bring an end to the Afghanistan war far sooner than unfortunately we're standing today.
And that's an excellent point, because the collateral murder video of the Apaches killing all those men and shooting up those children in the van, I mean, that was a nail in the coffin for the Iraq war. I mean, because of that video and other intelligence in the Iraq war logs, in particular, all the documentation of civilians that were killed at checkpoints by U.S. soldiers that the U.S. military just covered up, and Iraqis had no legal recourse to get not just reparations, but criminal charges for the people that murdered people at checkpoints. That made it impossible, when the Iraq war was ending, Obama actually had sent Secretary of Defense Robert Gates to Iraq to negotiate an extension of the status of forces agreement. So they didn't actually want to leave in the full capacity that they did, even though they still stayed. They wanted to leave more troops and keep the war going. But because of the impact that the collateral murder video had in Iraq, it became impossible for them to negotiate an extension of the status of forces agreement. That's when the Iraqi government actually stood firm and said, you're not staying unless we can try soldiers under Iraqi law. And that was a deal breaker. And so that's ultimately why the U.S. left Iraq in the capacity that it did. And so to know that there was actually a video that was way more graphic and way more people died about Afghanistan, I mean, if collateral murder had that impact in Iraq, I mean, just think, and in the U.S. too, just think of what a scandal it would have been, and, maybe could have ended the war a little sooner.
Yeah, and then there was also another horrific, I mean, there's been so many massacres, the Kunduz hospital bombing that Obama oversaw. I think, I don't even know how many civilians died there, but it's just absolutely a shocking war crime that he was never held accountable for, of course. But another massacre that Julian Assange has talked about as part of Operation Medusa. This is all part of the Afghan war logs that Manning submitted. Yeah, right? Operation Medusa, very fitting. And I'm going to read a quote from Julian Assange's interview. He said, "This was a C-130 cargo plane refitted with cannons on the side. It circled overhead and rained down shells. The war logs say 181 enemy were killed. The logs also say that there were no wounded or captured. It was a significant massacre. This event, the day when the largest number of people were killed in Afghanistan, has never been properly investigated by the old media," end quote. Now, of course, Daniel Hale has revealed that you are considered an enemy combatant if you are just 18, if you just appear to be like of age, and you're a male. So just imagine how many people were killed that were innocent civilians. And of course, with no charges or trial. I mean, it doesn't, like this whole phrase of like civilians injured versus enemy combatants. I mean, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. I don't know who any of these people were. The fact that no media actually investigated this, Julian Assange makes this incredible point that when this massacre was covered in the legacy media, it was covered in like almost like a romanticized way. Like this one guy was embedded on the ground. I forget with which corporate media outlet, and he was like acting all excited, like he was in fucking combat, and he was just like describing the scene of like this C-130 cargo plane like raining down shells, and like literally did not mention the fact that all these people had died. He was just like all fucking stoked that he was in the battle, right? And now he's battle tested. Just really quickly from The Nation, this really stuck with me. Islam Khan, a resident of Paktia, a heavily drone-bombed area of Afghanistan, he said, quote, "We are like ants for them. The murderers need to face a trial. If it's not happening, it just reveals that the Western world does not care about the Afghans they are murdering." I mean, it's heavy stuff, in that recent episode we did about the death squads. I mean, these are heinous war crimes. This is just sheer barbarism. Raining down bombs on children, CIA-sponsored death squads going and massacring children at these schools because they might be future Taliban. And here we are. The Taliban has taken over the country. I mean, what was it all for? It's sick. It's absolutely sick, Mike.
Yeah. I mean, over 100 people dying in a single incident. I mean, those two massacres that you just mentioned, Abby, I mean, even I hadn't heard of those until you just told me right now. And, so if I haven't heard of them, and it's like my job to follow this stuff, then you can guarantee that 99% of people in the United States haven't heard of them. But what are we seeing? All we're seeing right now, from the mainstream media and from most politicians, is this is why the U.S. needs to stay, because the Taliban are so bad. The Taliban are awful, and this is why the U.S. needs to stay in the country, as if some kind of anything good can come from the U.S. Like that's what the U.S. occupation means. That's what the U.S. in Afghanistan means.
That's the status quo.
Yeah, is that there are and those are like, obviously, I mean, those are really massive civilian tolls in a single attack. Like over 100 people dying in a single thing is a lot. It's hard to emphasize how many people that is. But other types of massacres where something's considered a massacre if like 5 people die. It's like if you are non-combatants and there's like a handful of people die, that is technically a massacre. So there should be another word for a massacre when you kill like upwards of 100 people. But anyways,
yeah, people are fucking mass murderers. I mean, let's just call them what they are. And we can't forget the Moab. I'm not even going to get into that because it's too devastating for me to relay that. But yeah, the Moab blast. We don't know how many people died with that because who was it? Not Petraeus, but someone else just basically said, we're not going to waste our time digging through dirt to count dead bodies, and then they blockaded all the media from the scene. So
right. But throughout the war, I mean, regularly there were airstrikes that killed a dozen people here and there, but it was so consistent that it was a feature of the war. Civilians in their homes, in their villages, largely at night, getting blown up while they're sleeping. That was, I mean, if you take out all the other parts of the occupation, soldiers going through your village, fighting happening through your village, your home getting raided, all of the brutality of U.S. occupation, foreign occupation, the Australian troops, the UK troops were pretty awful too. And in fact, are on video doing more war crimes in the U.S. right now, I think. But if you take all that out, I mean, just the terror of living under the drones and the bombers that are regularly taking out like entire families. That's the real legacy of the Afghanistan war. And so just to hear people in the mainstream media, these talking heads talking about how, oh, we can't abandon the Afghan people. It's so fucked up that we're leaving them to the Taliban and we're not doing this responsibly or whatever. It's like, when you contrast it with what Abby just mentioned and the fact that it gets deeper and darker, actually, that's the real legacy of the war. Let's watch a little video from our documentary, because I feel like it kind of encapsulates a little bit where we are. And while it was, as we mentioned, the Afghanistan paper showed that the generals knew it was lost a long time ago. But just, they were fine to just keep it going. When you watch this, it'll, I think, maybe make you a little more angry. But let's roll that from our doc.
Consultant and CIA asset Hamid Karzai, the first president.
With US backing, Hamid Karzai was inaugurated as president. His brother had been working for UNICAL, and Karzai was well acquainted with the pipeline plans.
From the very beginning, the US-led occupation of Afghanistan proved quite pointless.
The hunt for Al-Qaeda and Taliban goes on, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States and our other coalition allies in the global war of terrorism.
But how many Al-Qaeda have you captured?
We haven't captured any Al-Qaeda, but...
And how many have you actually managed to kill here in southeast Afghanistan?
We haven't killed any.
The war immediately became a quagmire, mostly laughed off by Washington, as the patriotic infection post 9/11 made them immune from criticism. Looking back, they knew this 20-year disaster was doomed from the start.
Sir, may I borrow your pointer?
Y'all point. You tell me where to point.
Okay.
I've been waiting all day to do this.
Just get me in the back of the head, Mr.
How much of what you've just described relates to or fulfills, I guess, whatever prior planning went into this? And how much of it, frankly, is a surprise?
How much of this is a surprise? What is this? What was taking place in the earlier phases was exactly as planned. It looked like nothing was happening. Indeed, it looked like we were in a, altogether now, quagmire.
I was going to say stalemate.
Stalemate, yes.
Rock and roll!
The unraveling war largely faded into the background as the US launched another full-scale invasion of Iraq less than 2 years later. And the disaster of Iraq quickly overshadowed the disaster of Afghanistan. The Afghanistan failure may have gotten more attention were it not for the catastrophic bloodshed in Baghdad. For the first few years, more than 10 times as many US troops were killed in Iraq than they were in Afghanistan.
There has been a lot of progress since 2001. After all, girls are back in school. You've got boys flying kites again in Afghanistan.
The anger of the country mounted against Bush's handling of Iraq, as US and civilian deaths in Afghanistan quietly grew year by year. And in 2008, Americans elected Barack Obama, the candidate who essentially ran on a strategy to end the wars and bring the troops home. But for anyone reading between the lines, Obama's anti-war argument was that we were focusing on the dumb war in Iraq and neglecting the good war in Afghanistan.
I don't oppose war in all circumstances, and when I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
With the same two-faced rhetoric, Obama announced the end of the Afghanistan war by announcing it was first going into overdrive.
And going forward, we will not blindly stay the course. Instead, we will set clear metrics to measure progress and hold ourselves accountable.
And that America has no interest in fighting an endless war in Afghanistan. And as our coalition agreed, by the end of 2014, the Afghans will be fully responsible for the security of their country.
Casualties surged. U.S. troops requiring limb amputations increased 60%, with a 90% increase in severe wounds to their genitalia. Other than that, Obama's strategy accomplished nothing. The grand plan to defeat the Taliban with 100,000 U.S. troops went up in smoke, proving once and for all the war was objectively unwinnable. When military defeat became clear, it began years of bumbling, confused generals using soldiers as bait to pointlessly fend off constant attacks with no discernible purpose.
Simply continue to tighten the noose until we get where we want to go. Excuse me.
Are we losing this war? Absolutely no way. Can the enemy win it? Absolutely no way.
Lieutenant General David Rodriguez, Deputy Commander of U.S. Forces in Afghanistan. General, great to see you, and it looks like you are ready to watch some Army football.
We sure are. We got our football signed by the team, we got our hat, and we're ready to watch some ball tonight.
We have made significant progress with regards to our primary mission of disrupting, dismantling, and ultimately defeating al-Qaeda.
We are not losing it, and the enemy cannot win.
This undeniable progress has allowed us to begin transitioning to Afghan security control.
I can see the columns tomorrow and all the parts. Look, the truth is that I feel like, we're making some steady progress. It's a slow win, I guess, is probably what we're accomplishing right on over here. It's not the way that I think both the Afghans, the international community, and the American people would like to see us conduct this war.
On one small mountainside alone, Korengal Valley, 150 U.S. troops died to...
All right. So I don't know. On our end, we weren't hearing the music from that. If you couldn't hear any music, then make sure to go to the real video and hear the cool music. But it was like something weird with the audio was only getting the one voiceover track or something. But whatever. It's go hear the real thing and put some headphones on. It'll be an experience. But yeah, that was kind of characteristic of the whole war. The generals that were just like, like watching football. I
like how that one guy was just like farts.
Yeah, that guy really screwed up. But it didn't stop him from getting a job when he got retired from the army, even though he was like disgraced, like in such an extreme way where he completely fell apart. And it's like, oh, it's a slow win. You know what I mean? It had already been like 15 years, but he's like, no, it's a slow win. We'll win in like another 30 years. That guy's doing good. He walked right into a nice defense contractor job, I believe, which is a tease to video we have coming out soon. But anyways, I think one of the important things, like, of course, there's going to be this rewrite, and probably on 9/11, after the withdrawal, Biden and everyone is going to be talking about what a success the Afghanistan war was. But here's what happened. When after 9/11, the Taliban agreed to turn over bin Laden, agreed to essentially surrender to the United States, to the Karzai government, and agreed to collaborate with them in taking down the terror networks in the country, the al-Qaeda training camps in the country. So they agreed to cooperate with the United States, said, we'll help you and make sure that this never happens to your country again. But the Bush and every president since then, Obama, Trump, said, we have to fight. The point of the war is to overthrow the Taliban because we can't negotiate with the Taliban. And if the Taliban are in power, that makes us unsafe. And we can't have that. So all of this fighting and dying is to make sure the Taliban are not in power because we cannot work with them to prevent terrorist attacks against the United States that are planned on their soil. So what happens now? After 20 years of fighting, the Taliban are in power in a negotiated surrender by the United States. But they're going to be saying, well, the Taliban are promising to make sure that there's no. So it's basically they're saying, oh, yeah, it's good. The Taliban agreed in the deal that they're not going to let terrorists against state from Afghanistan. Well, weren't they offering to do that 20 years ago also? And now you're acting like, oh, yeah, mission accomplished. We fought them for 20 years to get them to agree to do the thing that they said they were going to do at the outset of the war. So every life was a complete waste, even from the standpoint strategically of like, oh, yeah, we really care about going to Afghanistan to make sure there's no terrorist attacks launched against the U.S. We're in the same exact position, the offering that the Taliban gave to avoid a war that took, hundreds of thousands of lives completely pointlessly. So I think that's what people should remember about what's happening. And yeah, and it's we're gonna go to some other shots now. Let's bring this up, Dan. So after the one I highlighted in the doc there, secret meeting. So it's a headline we're going to show you, and it's going to get a little funnier after that. But all of this rhetoric about the Taliban just must be defeated. When Obama came in, the one before it, the one that says secret meeting, that one's good, but it's going to come next. So, when Obama came in and announced the troop surge, it was just saying the Taliban are reprehensible. We cannot let them have any power. We have to fight to drive them out. Well, right now, the U.S. is meeting with the Taliban. They've been negotiating with them for a long time. The reason that the Taliban, there was such a hectic situation in Kabul because everyone's like, oh, how is the soldiers going to get out? How's the embassy personnel going to get out? The Taliban could have easily, once they took the city, really gave them a hammering on the way out. But they negotiated not. They're talking. They're saying, hey, the Taliban have won the war. The defeated side, the U.S., is now negotiating the terms of their surrender, of their withdrawal. And let's go to this next tweet, the tweet that's the tweet about the U.S. Taliban. Okay, I'm going to read this. American troops and Taliban working just yards apart at the perimeter of Kabul airport. It's hard to tell them apart. Similar uniforms, weapons, Kevlar, eye protection. They're not pointing guns at each other. They're working to coordinate security entry to the airport. So imagine, and actually go to the next photo.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, why do they look alike?
This is what the Taliban looks like now. Looks like a Army Special Forces guy because they just took all the gear that were left for them by the Afghan army, which is all the surplus from the U.S. Army that they gave. They gave all their throwaways to the Afghan army, and now the Taliban are walking around Kabul looking exactly like U.S. soldiers, but not just looking exactly like U.S. soldiers, but just literally imagine working yards away from the person that you were told for the last 20 years you had to risk life and limb and killing civilians in order to fight this guy and prevent them from getting any power. But the funny thing about this is that this is honestly the outcome that the U.S. has been going for most of the war. I mean, once they knew, when the troop surge happened back in like 2010, and it did nothing to push back the Taliban. I mean, with the U.S. with 140,000 troops, thousands of more NATO foreign forces, mercenaries, Afghan fighters, 300,000 of them. With all of that, they didn't make a dent in the Taliban fighting forces. They knew that it was a lost cause. And so secretly, behind the scenes, they have been trying to make a deal where the Taliban share power somehow with the Taliban. And so it may seem wild to people, oh my God, there's U.S. soldiers 2 feet away from a Taliban fighter wearing literally the same uniform, coordinating security, like literally working together. But that's honestly what the U.S. has been going for the whole time. Once they knew that they couldn't actually defeat the Taliban, they were just lying that that's what they were trying to do. So while they're telling families such as that, like behind the scenes, this is what they've been doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that Biden actually carried out a bombing raid, killing 20 civilians, including children, targeted a medical clinic and a high school on his way out to try to basically stave off the inevitable. And they have asserted the right to continue bombing the country, which is, really important to say, that this caveat in the peace deal is that the U.S. can just have the right to bomb. And also probably have CIA on the ground, especially when we get to some of these later headlines about an open call to now help the Mujahideen resistance against the Taliban.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong there? So, I feel like we've already discussed, why this happened, because Biden, even in our documentary, we show a clip from him basically saying he is committed to continuing the occupation with a few thousand ground forces. So it is interesting that he decided to actually see this through. So a lot of people are asking, what happened to all the oil, the minerals? How come we left without getting them or leaving bases? What was it all for if the U.S. empire didn't really get anything out of it? Well, I think that this is going to come out later once there's more investigative reporting on this. But the opium trade, booming, more than 90% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan. This disturbing cycle of protecting the fields. And as John Motter explains, who was a Marine who served in Afghanistan, he talks about how, they were ordered to protect the fields from their commanders, and then having it circle back where a lot of his friends and comrades are now addicted to opium. Opioids, to deal with PTSD and such. But it's worth noting also that the NSA in 2013 actually rolled out an unprecedented mass surveillance system. This was one of like 5 countries in the entire world that was fully surveilled. Not just the way that Edward Snowden talks about how we're surveilled with data mining and all of that. No, this was mass surveillance of every single phone call was actually registered and transcribed coming out of Afghanistan. So this is all domestic and international phone calls. So you're telling me that this giant drug trafficking trade of black operations was being done without knowledge and actually approval by the CIA, by the U.S. military. So just like the cocaine trafficking in Colombia, obviously this was being done with complete oversight with the U.S. I think that's a side note. So why didn't we get the mining minerals? What happened there? Well, we can't set up mining installations or huge operations in terms of oil pipelines with an active insurgency. How could that happen? I mean, just imagine the Taliban continuing to attack these multi-million-dollar installations that are trying to extract all the minerals, and it just wasn't feasible, and it never was. So instead of setting up the neo-colony that the U.S. wanted, all that really was beneficial for the empire were the people who were profiting. And you can look at this graph here. Stephen Semler compiled actually that the top 5 military contractors received $50 billion in public funds. We're not even talking about how much they raked in profits in general, which is astro-fucking-nomical. We're talking about public subsidization of defense contractors. All right? Before the Afghanistan war started, they received $50 billion in public funds. Last year, $170 billion. It just shows you the exponential rate of growth of actual eating up public subsidies for defense contractors. I mean, that's shocking. I actually didn't even know that that's how much money was being funneled to defense contractors from public funds. I thought it was bad enough, the revolving door and all the money that was just handed to them every time a drone was fired, every time, a bomber was flying. I mean, but this is like such next level that I didn't even know this black hole that you can just keep going down. But I mean, I don't know, Mike. I mean, what is your take on going back to the notion about why did Biden follow through, and also this botched withdrawal? Because of course the mainstream media, the corporate-owned media, is using the withdrawal as a reason to be like, look, we should have stayed. Biden fucked it all up. I mean, this chaos, the airport stampede, the poor souls that fell off the airplane. It's just absolutely horrifying. Why did this happen? Why do you think Biden followed through? And I mean, the intellectual dishonesty, too, of the people who praised Trump for 4 years. And, where's the consistency here by being like, yeah, Biden did it and Trump was too much of a pussy to actually end the war when he could have the whole time?
Well, I think you made a really important point about like minerals, pipelines, all of the resource wealth that the U.S. empire wanted to go Afghanistan to get in the first place. You can see why there is competing takes from the ruling class on the end of the Afghanistan war. If you're in the oil industry that's seeking to profit, like Unocal, inviting the Taliban to their ranch in the 90s, or if you're like a company that's a mining company that wants to mine all those minerals, which there's a bunch of articles now all of a sudden appearing in economic publications about the mineral wealth in Afghanistan. If you're in those industries, the war ending is good for you because the Taliban just a week ago went on BBC and said, we're open for business with Western corporations and with U.S. corporations. So for a mining company or an oil company to try to extract the resources of Afghanistan when there's a big ass war going on is like not really possible. But to just go back to negotiating with the Taliban as business partners, not the puppets or the neo-colonial subjects that they had hoped at the beginning of the war, but they said, well, that's a lost cause. We might as well deal with them as potential business partners again. That's good for those sectors of the ruling class. But for the weapons industry, the people that are making all the missiles to be dropped on Afghanistan, the people that are making all the trucks to go get blown up in Afghanistan, they're not happy about the war ending because there's a lot of ordnance being dropped on that country, a lot of trucks getting blown up, and their profits are going to take a hit. So there's not total unity within the U.S. ruling class about where their interests lie in this particular war or another. If they have different interests, the job of the state, the imperialist state, the Pentagon, Washington, the job of the imperialist state is to manage the common affairs of the ruling class. So to understand that there's these different dynamics within the ruling class and different interests, some want the war to continue indefinitely, some want the war to end. It's about managing what is best for all of them as a collective. What's really best for the U.S. capitalist class? And the calculation by the Pentagon, by the Biden administration, is ending the war is what's best, not for the people of Afghanistan, not for the working class of the United States, but that's what's best for the U.S. capitalist class, to get out of this humiliating defeat in this country where we can't make any profits off of it except for the profits that we drop in the country in the form of bombs that go to like 5 corporations that are profiting, or we can deal with it in a different way and then move on to focus on taking down other countries that will be a bigger boon for capitalists in the United States. So that's ultimately why they went with it. And yes, the withdrawal this is a fair criticism of Biden. The withdrawal is totally botched. There's no reason why. I mean, the day where all those horrible images came, about 7 Afghans died from being crushed, under the wheels of the plane or in the crowds because you got fucking 10,000 soldiers there. They can't set up an orderly way to evacuate. It's like, isn't that like it's supposed to be like a logistics machine, the U.S. military. The fact that they couldn't figure that out is because they just didn't give a shit. 7 people were crushed. 3 people were shot and killed by U.S. soldiers, and witnesses say they just shot into the crowd because there was chaos. And then I don't know how many, like 5 or 6 people actually fell from the aircraft. One was a child, a 17-year-old soccer player, actually fell from the aircraft because these pilots decide to take off while there's 1,000 people underneath the plane and clinging to the sides of the plane. Like, you didn't have to do that. Like, the Taliban weren't overrunning the airfield. You didn't have to act like if you didn't take off that second, we were all going to get killed and strung up and lynched by the Taliban. That was just completely absurd. So, yeah, I mean, it was completely botched in the sense that they knew that the Taliban had taken over the rest of the country. They knew that they could come in at any time. I mean, like the stupidity of the generals that like you saw in that montage and were revealed in the Afghanistan papers. That's just being like, oh, I don't know what's going on. That continued to the very last moment. They're just like, oh, yeah, we got like 3 more months, 6 more months, another year or so before the Afghanistan government falls, which is funny that they admitted it's going to fall sometime. It's probably going to be 3 months to a year, though. It's like that's a real victory that you leave being like, yeah, the puppet forces we set up are guaranteed to fall, but we got some time. So and then they're all panicked, like, oh, my God, the Taliban are here. We got to get out of here. And just like didn't care about any of the Afghan people they said they care so much about. And so now all we got are just photos of soldiers saving babies and giving water to little kids after this immediate, complete disaster where the military completely failed, completely panicked, and, several people died who didn't have to, a fitting ending.
By the way, for some reason, it's drained the battery completely, and it's definitely going to die soon.
At 5%, we're going to go to the mic audio.
We're going to go to mic audio. Okay.
Dan, just so you know, our on this laptop, we only have 2 ports. One is for the camera, one's for the microphone, but the battery's going to die. So we're going to have to unplug it and plug in a charger, which is going to be the microphone port. So we're going to have to go to computer audio, sadly.
Yeah, sadly. But you know what? The refugees, we're taking them in, Mike. We're taking in all the Afghans who helped us. I love that framing, right? Like, don't worry, all the Afghan interpreters and translators and all the people who are fucking helping the goons on deck, the CIA death squads, like those sisters and assets, don't worry, we're gonna welcome them all in. Fuck the hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians who are impoverished, who are fleeing for their lives, who don't have anywhere to go. I mean, it's just unbelievable that, countries like the U.S. and Canada, I don't even know how many Afghan refugees we're taking in, but Canada is taking in like 20,000. And, you know, neighboring countries, actually neighboring Afghanistan, are taking in millions of people. Like that's what's so funny. It's like, where are the accolades to the actual countries in the Middle East who absorb the refugees from these disastrous interventions? Where are the accolades for them? Instead, the U.S. gets a pat on the back. Canada gets a pat on the back for opening their doors to 20,000 refugees. And, you know, it's just incredible, the media coverage of this, because poll after poll shows, depicted by the mainstream media, that the majority of Americans want to accept the refugees that helped us. Well, what about everyone else? We caused this. We need to take in all the refugees who want to come, all of them. That should be like the modus operandi. Okay, you cause a war, you absorb the actual costs of that war. So the human toll, open your goddamn doors. And if you don't want that, then don't facilitate these disastrous regime change wars. So let's get into the insane, absolutely hysterical media reaction. And let me insane habitable, so I'm sure it's way worse. I'm just seeing like headlines. I mean, I can't even fucking imagine what's being played out on Fox, CNN, MSNBC. God can only, I mean, I can't even imagine these panels over and over again. I know how this shit works. I've watched enough corporate media to just know how this works, but it's just panel after panel of intelligence analysts and defense contractors, right? Employees basically saying why it's such a disaster. And this is why you see Biden's approval rating is now plummeting. I don't give a shit about Biden, but this is just a hilarious effect of corporate media indoctrinating everyone to be like, you know, this is a bad thing. All of a sudden, this is a bad thing, even though the vast majority of Americans agree that the war was a disaster. It was completely pointless, and they want it to end. I mean, I guess because of the botched withdrawal, like their coverage of all of this and hyping up how much of a disaster the withdrawal was has now just made people be like, okay, this is bad. And that's how dangerous propaganda is, right? Because despite the coverage of all of this chaos ensuing, the vast majority of the Afghanistan population want this. They want this. You would never know that by reading the news. So do you want to talk about this approval rating thing, or is it just pointless?
It's just funny. I mean, 41% approval rating is pretty bad, which, you know, probably a lot of things have to do with that. The Afghanistan thing doesn't look good for him because, you know, if he had been able to have a smooth ending, you know, people probably would have liked that because most Americans wanted the Afghanistan war to end. I mean, all of the mainstream media that's like condemning it never really talk about how ending the Afghanistan war immediately polls really high, more than 50% of people in the United States. So for him to actually take a hit for this when it's a popular position shows that he handled it pretty bad. I mean, other things too. I mean, he's handled COVID no different than Trump, honestly. And the fact that they talk about it in the past tense, like, oh, we're moving on. It's like, COVID is not moving on, but that's a whole other story. And, you know, I think, you know, it's funny. They like put together like this montage of all the Biden promises kept from his campaign. And it was just like the lamest, like, I don't even remember he promised that, but okay. It was like random shit.
Juneteenth, baby.
Yeah, right.
We got it.
Good.
We did it.
I mean, I agree that that's good, but all these other, it's like he doesn't, all these like, I don't know. It's just like he hasn't really done, everyone's like, okay, aesthetically things are different, but that's pretty much it. And that's what they're going for. So, and also like, it's funny that Harris's approval rating is like really bad too, like really, really bad. And that's why she's right now in Vietnam, in Singapore. She's on this tour of Asia, which is really just a whip up hostility towards China tour, going to all these countries in Asia and saying, you have to confront China. So going to this region where these countries want to cooperate, have peaceful coexistence, collaboration on development. And Kamala Harris is there to say, no, you guys got to confront China or you're not going to get as much shit from us. It's one or the other, trying to stir shit up. But the whole reason that she's on this tour, they said this. The party sent her to try to make her approval rating go up because it's very likely she'll be running for president in 2024 when Biden craps out.
We did it, Joe.
So what? Nothing to make your approval rating go up than like a war saber rattling tour.
Remember
around the
that?
World.
Remember when she was on the phone with Joe? She's like, Joe, we did it, Joe. We fucking did it, baby. Did what? So we got 5% left. I'm gonna go quick, go. So this is incredible too. So all the media outlets just becoming, beside themselves with grief, mourning the death of this occupation, crying about women's rights, all of this. What's hilarious is that these outlets didn't give a shit about Afghanistan for the last couple of years. Guess how many combined minutes of national evening news broadcasts on CBS, ABC, and NBC were dedicated to Afghanistan last year, Mike?
Man, I don't know.
Okay, so 5 minutes total from all of the, and that is actually surprisingly high. And because it was only because of this,
5 minutes total, and how long?
No, 5 minutes total out of all of them. They only dedicated a grand total of 5 minutes between the three outlets to Afghanistan in the last year.
In the last year.
Oh,
wow.
So yeah, and this was only because of this tentative peace deal. It's like they almost had to, because they got the fucking AP press wire and they're like, all right, like headline today. But then if you look at the previous 5 years, it's actually only like 360 minutes, which is essentially 24 minutes per network per year. And it's just unbelievable. It's like, where were you guys? How come you didn't give a shit when there was record number of civilians being killed, bombs being dropped, complete devastation and destruction of an entire country? Where were you? Where the hell were you? And now you have the audacity to pretend like you give a shit? It's insulting. It's insulting to our intelligence. But, it's really sad how this affects people. All of a sudden, it's just like clockwork. All of a sudden, people are just like, oh my God. There's this incredible headline. I don't know if you want to pull it up now, Dan, about when did the left basically like abandon human rights or something. It's absolutely insane. So it's from The Week. And it says, the left stopped caring about human rights. It's remarkable how quickly liberals abandon the women of Afghanistan. Who the fuck is this person who wrote this article, and where have you been for the last 20 years? I don't even know if anything else needs to be said about it. Oh, and by the way, this is from the The Week, the left stopped caring about human rights. Yeah, it's not from The Week. It's actually from the Atlantic, which is even better, because the Atlantic is a publication whose editor-in-chief is named Jeffrey Goldberg. He is a former IDF prison guard who tortured Palestinians. So please spare me the pontification about human rights. I mean, I get so angry because I just can't even, I'm glad we don't have cable. I would have probably just smashed the television by this point, but it's unbelievable, y'all. Should we switch this shit out, or should we wait till 1% and live big?
We see you all in the super chats, and we're going to get to them in a second. Appreciate all of you, especially Juan Lopez. Thank you for the big time super chat. And that's actually, the stream is meant to be a fundraiser for our new film, which we're about to talk about. But we just wanted to get through some of the Afghanistan stuff. And yeah, so apologize to everyone that the audio is about to get a little shittier as we switch over. Do you mind? Make sure you unplug the mic.
This is the one being, okay.
Dan, can you still hear us? Cool. All right.
Yeah, so we're back, baby. Sorry about the audio drop. This is our first time doing all this in our new setup and stuff. So next time we'll have it figured out a little bit better. But hopefully y'all can hear us good now. I wanted to actually credit Responsible Statecraft for that, the statistics that I got about the media coverage. I know someone dedicated a lot of time to calculating that. And I need to give them credit for that. So
they watched 1 year's worth of 5 channels and counted up the seconds that equaled 5 minutes. That's pretty wild.
So let's hear from Press Secretary Jake Sullivan, taking some press questions about the Afghanistan war, because I think this really just says it all about the nature of this Beltway establishment press, who essentially just serve as stenographers for the Pentagon and the U.S. empire, and it's just really hilarious. Mike, I want to get your reaction to it. So let's check that out. Dan, if you can bring that up.
Yeah, what is President Biden's response to the people of Afghanistan who are now in the hands of the Taliban terrorists and feel abandoned by the United States, or to those in Taiwan and elsewhere that are fearful that the U.S. will abandon them to the aggression of China? And follow-up to that is, what is President Biden's response to people in Israel and other countries who might also believe that the U.S. will abandon them to terrorists?
So to the first question, President Biden and all of us, as I said in my opening comments, are heartbroken by the human consequences that have unfolded and could continue to unfold in Afghanistan. We believe passionately in human rights and human dignity, and we want to work with the international community to advance that wherever we can. But President Biden was not prepared to have American men and women continue to fight and die in the civil war of another country in order to achieve that. We will use every other tool at our disposal to achieve that, and we will do so day after day, month after month in the period ahead on behalf of the people of Afghanistan. To your question about allies, we gave 20 years of American blood, treasure, sweat, and tears in Afghanistan. We gave them every capacity in terms of training and equipment to stand up and fight for themselves. And at some point, it was the time for the United States to say that the Afghan people had to stand up for themselves. We believe that our commitments to our allies and partners are sacrosanct and always have been. We believe our commitment to Taiwan and to Israel remains as strong as it's ever been. Keep in mind that with respect to Afghanistan, we said back in 2011 that we would be out in 2014. We stayed another 7 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, first of all, I'm sorry, what does this have to do with Israel and Taiwan?
Well, I mean, it really reveals a lot. I mean, first of all, it's funny that they're like, oh, you've abandoned the Afghan people to Taliban. The Taliban controlled most of the country anyway for like a while. Like ever since the U.S. withdrew from like most of the countries, like the Taliban's been in, that's like one of the Afghanistan papers revelations, is that the U.S. has been saying, oh no, we control all this area, when really like 70% of the country was already controlled by the Taliban. And the areas that were under like U.S. control, that just meant you had a fucking U.S. base in the village that would be shooting through the village fighting the Taliban all day. And then at night, the Taliban would come into the village anyway and do their little courts and do their own little local governance and everything. So like a lot of places that were under like U.S. control, the Taliban was coming in at night and running the show anyway. And then it was just worse to live there under U.S. control, because then it was a magnet for fighting and for violence. but it reveals a lot. I mean, to say it was because other countries did get nervous. Other regimes that rely 100% on the U.S. empire giving them military support and cover, like Israel, like Taiwan. These are countries that if we had a revolution in the United States, which is going to happen, and we, end U.S. imperialism, give self-determination, close all the bases, give self-determination, all the neo-colonies, all this stuff, places like Israel and Taiwan would not last very long. And so there's, of course, this nervousness among these countries that rely their existence is 100% based on serving a purpose to the U.S. empire, just like the Afghan government did for 20 years. It's the puppet government served a purpose to the U.S. empire. So they're like, we're with you. We're going to help you. We're going to make sure nothing bad happens to you until you outlive your purpose. And you're not a use to us anymore. And there's an understanding, all of the little junior partners to the U.S. and all of the neo-colonies and all of the like puppet regimes and the reliant regimes, they know that one day their usefulness could run out to the empire, and the empire doesn't really care about them. It just cares about their usefulness. Same is true for Israel. If it becomes too inconvenient for the U.S. empire, they'll toss Israel aside also. So it was revealed. I mean, the fact that it was like a media question, though, that like this guy was like, what about Israel? What about Taiwan? It like just says a lot about where like the mass media is at. But it represented a real nervousness among these other regimes that are really just propped up by the U.S. imperialism.
So then, of course, we can't close out this section without talking about the outrage over women's rights, right? We just mentioned that Atlantic article hilariously, this weaponization of women. This has been actually part of the CIA playbook since the beginning. Again, a WikiLeaks cable revealed in 2010 that the CIA had openly talked about how feminism was needed to be exploited in terms of reducing Western opposition to the ongoing military occupation in Afghanistan. So all of these people being like, what will happen to the Afghan women if we leave? As if the Afghanistan war destroying the whole country was somehow advancing women's rights. As if somehow you could advance women's rights in the midst of a U.S. military occupation begetting a civil war. As if funding the Mujahideen holy warriors under Carter and Reagan that deliberately staved off the advancements of the SAR revolution, which, again, documented by the CIA, gave peasants' rights, women's advancements were happening. That was all outlined, but they knew that was all worth it, right, to try to bankrupt the Soviet Union. So they discarded and cast aside the notion of women's rights as some sort of pillar. And so do not give me that they give a shit about women's rights. This is all just an exploitation of women, right? It's a weaponization of women, and it's really, really insulting. And so hopefully women's rights can advance. Hopefully there can be some resistance that's galvanized, that's organic, because self-determination is really what's most important. Lifting the boot off the neck of all these people around the world is what's needed in order to advance women's rights and other rights. So let's talk about some of these propaganda photos that have been passed around that I've seen all over Twitter of, patronizing as fuck of soldiers dumping water down the throats of Afghan babies and stuff. It's like, okay, you can give a water bottle to a child, and I'm sure that they know how to drink it. They're not barbarians. I know that you like to pretend that these people live in caves, but I'm pretty sure they know how to hold a water bottle.
There's a good one, carrying a baby. Oh, there's another one. Got some women.
Look at all of them. Look, they really care about babies.
Maternal instinct. There's another one there.
The soldiers doing good,
Right.
The soldiers doing good.
All right, let's watch the video.
Yeah, let's see the water bottle photo op. I think it's just.
No, this is a video.
Oh my God! Really? Jesus Christ! Look at it. Everyone gets a drop of water.
Right. It's like, dude, you're the fucking army. You don't have thousands of water bottles there. It's literally the army. Like, you will die if you don't drink the water. Like, what? How do they not have? Why are they all sharing a water bottle? We're the biggest army ever in the history of the world. I know that there's tons and tons of water, like, right nearby.
Oh my God. Okay, so this was my favorite one, though, and I know we're going over. We need to get onto the documentary, but we have to talk about some of these other headlines before we close this out. I mean, by CNN, the Taliban are sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals the world desperately needs.
Oh, yeah.
Saying the quiet part out loud, but hilarious.
And Claire, there is a delicate balance here, right? Understandably, the IMF
that frames this whole argument that, like, we need these minerals to solve climate change.
Right.
To solve climate change.
For batteries. So we don't have to use oil. So we need to mine all these minerals, use factories to make them into these batteries, and then we'll put them in electric cars, and then the climate will be saved.
Yeah, and they even spell this out, like in this World Bank report, in this CNN article, they say, quote, private sector development and diversification is constrained by insecurity, political instability, weak institutions, inadequate infrastructure, widespread corruption, and a difficult business environment. Oh, can you imagine these people at the World Bank writing this up, like totally removed from the situation? Penthouse apartments being like, we really need these minerals, but it's really a tough business environment in Afghanistan. Like, give me it. I mean, it's just unbelievable, which it brings me to the Washington Post. Next, the Mujahideen resistance to the Taliban starts now, but we need help. Mike, I know that we're the United States of amnesia and that we're all fucking goldfish in a bowl and we forget what happened 5 seconds ago, but like, really? Really? This is the call to now fund the Mujahideen resistance to the Taliban? They need guns. They need supplies. Quote, Ahmed Massoud, the leader of the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, says Mujahideen fighters are prepared once again to take on the Taliban. His fighters need more weapons, more ammunition, and more supplies, he says. The United States and its allies have left the battlefield, but America can still be a, quote, great arsenal of democracy, end quote, as Franklin D. Roosevelt said when coming to the aid of the beleaguered British before the U.S. entry into World War II. What do you even say about this at this point? It is unbelievable, truly.
I mean, and that's what they were, right before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The CIA had already been in Afghanistan and was going to enact a plan where they organized a tribal rebellion against the Taliban government using a mujahideen against the Taliban. So they were already doing this. They funded mujahideen against the Soviets, or first against the Afghan government to bait the Soviets in, and then against the Soviets. That, of course, split. Some went to the Northern Alliance, some went to the Taliban, some went to other groups, some went nowhere. But then in the 90s, they again started funding and organizing anti-Taliban militias to have a revolution and to overthrow the Taliban government. And they were like ready to pull the trigger on the plan until 9/11 happened. And they said, oh, well, we don't have to worry about this plan. We can just invade the country. And so they had already been planning on doing this. And we already know what this is going to look like. This hypothetical article about, oh, we should support the Mujahideen against the Taliban. That was the death squads that the CIA ran throughout the entire 20-year war.
That's why I fear the CIA is not going to actually leave.
Right. I mean, they're still going to be pumping money into these people. They're going to be happy if they make things difficult for the Taliban. But we already know the character of that. If the Mujahideen, the CIA is already funding them, they're already working with them, and that's what we documented in that short video, which you could find CIA Stories, I think number 2. They just it was just like a mass. They just did mass executions. They'd raid a village, take everyone outside, and just shoot all the men in the head, like execution style. That's the Mujahideen forces that this. I doubt this article mentions that. In fact, I haven't read it, but I would have guessed
don't read it.
They don't. But that's kind of gross.
Well, it's absolutely mind-numbing for so many reasons, but it's also crazy because, as you mentioned before, the Taliban has just taken all the guns and military equipment from the U.S. So now it's just going to be funding both. You know what I mean? It's the whole funding both sides, in Syria and all this shit. It's okay, great. So it's just going to fuel an ongoing war by feeding and seeding weapons to now the resistance of the Taliban. I mean, Jesus Christ, how much more are we going to fall into this giant rabbit hole, and continue this? And sadly, I think the answer is quite a long time, because as Mike just mentioned, the CIA forces are not going to leave, and you better believe that they're going to stay and try to do some shit to try to weaken the Taliban, because the Taliban's, again, not a reliable business partner, as outlined by the World Bank. Going back to why Clinton couldn't set up the Unocal pipeline, going back to, pre 9/11, they wanted a way to get into Afghanistan and try to do this, and 9/11 was the perfect gift to them. Let's move on.
Just really,
yeah. So, is there any closing words about Afghanistan?
Yeah, just so we've done, honestly, the second ever episode of Empire Files was about Afghanistan. So if you want to go way back to 2015, you could find an old episode.
9/11 and the Belligerent Empire.
It was the title of it, yeah. But it's episode number 2. And we've done a bunch of other stuff. There's a great interview with an Afghanistan veteran named John Motter. There's the Afghanistan War Imperial Conspiracy. There's a CIA death squads in Afghanistan. And there's a video that Abby did about the withdrawal, a month or so ago. So we have a lot of content there. We really just scratched the surface of this thing. Also, if you want to get kind of more in depth about the defeat of the U.S., as Abby mentioned, I've done a few interviews recently. The ones I'd recommend are on Breakthrough News, which is a network that we really love. Eugene Puryear's on it. Rania Khalek's on it. I did an interview with them recently. That one I'd recommend. Hassan Abi just had me on, and so that go to his YouTube. We get into a lot of shit there. And Jacobin Magazine just did an interview with me that I feel kind of really lays out kind of the core points. So everything we didn't get to in this, if you still have questions about Afghanistan that you can't get answered by all our video content, you can go to those interviews. But, we had to talk about it here because it's such a historic defeat for the empire.
Yeah, so let's move on to the crux of the conversation, which is Hassan's new mansion, Young Turks. What else have we missed recently?
Force the vote.
So yeah, let's dig in. So Hassan, no, just kidding.
We're not talking about it.
We're not talking about any of that. We're going to talk about climate change, because you look out the fucking window and there's no more debate to be had. I mean, there's fires that have completely wreaked havoc all over California. I mean, we're lucky to actually not experience the brunt of the fires here in LA. Yet last year we were completely incapacitated because of the poisonous air for months and months. It was absolutely devastating. Of course, Australia, where 1 billion different creatures passed.
A billion living
things died in the fires last year. So this is why we chose to do our second feature-length film. Our first one being Gaza Fight for Freedom, which got incredible reception. And if you haven't watched it, please do. It's available for free on YouTube, and it's available in multiple languages on Vimeo. We are doing our second feature film on climate change, but not just on climate change. It is like everything we do with Empire Files. It's through the lens of the US Empire being the largest institutional contributor to climate change, right? This one is featuring the US military as the largest polluting institution in the world. And it's not just with direct emissions, which are astronomical. I mean, you can look at, just the amount of fuel that the US military consumes and emits. It is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world and the largest emitter, as I just mentioned, in terms of a system, not a nation state. But it's also environmental degradation, because we know that climate change is exacerbated by things like deforestation, destruction of sustainability, agriculture, things like that. So when you are destroying life systems, like ancient coral reefs, for example, I mean, these habitations that harbor, life that is unmatched anywhere on Earth. I mean, these are very sensitive things that are completely destroyed by the US military. So before we get into really the crux of this, why don't we play the teaser really quick for people who haven't seen it, and then we're gonna explain a little bit more about it.
There's no longer any debate to be had. Our planet. There's no longer any debate to be had. Our planet is on a collision course with disaster.
Urgent warnings.
Dangerous, record-breaking heat.
We're now living in the early stages.
Terrifying signs of things to come.
Mass displacement, deaths, and extinctions are already here. Whether the planet can remain habitable for human beings has become a haunting question.
Climate change protests happening right now.
Part of a global call for action.
We know there are many culprits: corporations, policymakers, mass consumption. But what if there was one single entity that by itself will bring planetary collapse? One single organization, one single enemy, that not only produced enough toxic destruction to destroy the planet on its own, but was also subject to virtually no regulations, no oversight, no accountability, and as of yet, no blame. If there was a monster like that, shouldn't it be dragged out of the dark and into the center of the struggle to save the planet?
All right. So we know that that teaser is a little cryptic. We don't really get into the breadth of what we plan to cover in this film. And this is actually the first time we're talking about this film, how it came together, what the plan is, what we're going to be doing, all of that. I did one kind of short interview about the concept in general recently on Popular Resistance, but this is the first look everyone's going to get about what we have planned and what we're going to be doing and all the different facets that we're going to get into. And this live stream actually is a fundraiser to raise money for this film. And so all the super chats, all the donations that you make by going to earthsgreatestenemy.com, our Patreon, it's going to be our focus for the next, hopefully less than a year, but we will see. And so special thank you to Juan Lopez, who gave us the $100 super chat, David Rydell gave us $70. Thank you so much. And we're going to go through all the other super chats as soon as we get a moment. But it's making it possible for us to make this. And so we're going to go into kind of the concepts that are behind this. And the quote that we show in that teaser is from someone, Professor Barry Sanders, who wrote a book called The Green Zone, where he basically calculates the amount of carbon emissions that the U.S. military puts out based on like the arsenal, like how many B-52 bombers, how many Apaches, how many tanks, and how much carbon emissions do they all spit out. And all the bases that the U.S. has, you know, the 900 military bases around the world, all that. And that quote comes from that if every car was taken off the road, every factory was shut down, it wouldn't matter as long as the U.S. military keeps churning on as it is. And these are like hidden numbers. Like most of this stuff is all actually unknown. So it's definitely much worse than it was outlined in that book. And that book was written in 2009. And if we know anything about the growth of the U.S. military machine, it's gotten a lot bigger since 2009. A lot more money pumped into creating these things, opening up new bases, and things like that. But and just in terms of carbon emissions, you know, as Abby mentioned, consumes more hydrocarbon than most countries, the biggest consumer of fossil fuels. I saw one of the super chats saying it's not just the military, but fossil fuels as a whole. Totally agree. That's kind of all of the climate change report is saying the number one thing that has to happen is curbing carbon emissions. And of course, the use of fossil fuels is at the top of that. But Abby, I don't know if you want to, before we get into what we plan for the film and all the different facets we get into, do you want to talk about this new IPCC report and kind of the context in which we're doing this film?
Yeah, of course. So the IPCC report just came out recently, and this is like a UN report, right, by a lot of like, you know, establishment, whatever, if you could call it, like scientists who are working with governments. And so I would imagine it's a little bit more conservative than probably the numbers actually articulate. And keep in mind that militarism from the US and every other fucking country are omitted from all of these treaties, the Paris Climate Accords, the Kyoto Treaty. Like, so that isn't even taken into consideration when it comes to the solution here.
Yes, that's actually, if I could just say, like, so when all this celebration is, the world came together and we agreed to cut our carbon emissions. Like at Kyoto and Paris, it's like they're not including their militaries. So like it's not just the U.S., it's all the other countries, all the other imperialist countries that are doing this also. So when Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, great, but you're cutting out the military from that. It's just kind of striking when you learn that they don't include it in these agreements.
Yeah, and I mean, basically the report, I'm not going to go into it, but it basically just said that it's code red for humanity. Pretty horrifically dire predictions here, giving us like, I don't know, a couple of years to change course, which brings me to the premise of the film, because it's not just the U.S. military. I see some people in the chat being like, no, the U.S. military isn't the largest contributor to climate change. Okay, here's the problem though, is that the U.S. military is omitted from largely the entire environmental movement and conversation about climate change. But here's the thing, as I said before, it's not just about carbon emissions, even though they are much more drastic than you think. It's the production of weapons. It's the deployment of weapons. It's the use of fossil fuels, but also beyond that, it is the immense amount of pollution and environmental destruction put out by the US military that exacerbates the effects of climate change. That makes it more difficult to fight and stave off climate change. And yes, Google it. The US military is the largest institutional polluting force on the planet. Okay, wrap your mind around that. This is an intervention. This is an injection that's necessary into the movement. And we hope that this film can be a game changer. Right now, we are 1/4 almost of the way fully funded. We have a couple donors on the line that hopefully we can bring us halfway funded, but you know, we have a long way to go because we want to make this great. We want to make it on the same production level as Gaza Fights for Freedom, but it's also going to make, you know, we want to be able to travel to the frontline communities that are fighting for demilitarization and on the front lines of the struggle there. And so, Mike, why don't you take away talking about who Dar Jamel is and what our trip to Alaska is going to be?
Yeah, and so we're going to get into all the different facets that we're going to, because like people always focus on like, oh, well, the carbon emissions thing. I mean, that's a fact that the U.S. military alone puts out enough carbon emissions to make the planet unlivable for human beings in the not so distant future. That's a fact. Of course,
in certain areas,
Right.
we know that the rich people will be fine.
Sure, yeah, no, they'll be in a bunker or something, or on Mars or something like that. And, like if we're looking at nation states, like, the U.S. per capita is the largest emitter of carbon emissions. And that's not including its military. But the military as like an organization, I mean, the idea that if there was like a company, say there was like a big oil company that put out as much pollution as the U.S. military, it would be like a big scandal. It'd be like, how is this one company that's not regulated, nothing's enforced against it, it's allowed to get away with this much shit? It would be a massive scandal, and something probably would happen to that company. When we get into all the different ways that the U.S. military pollutes, other than carbon emissions, you'll start to see the full pictures. How is this entity that is not bound by anything allowed to cause so much destruction to habitats and to people and for the survivability of people on the planet? But before we get into that, we're going to talk about our plans in the near future. So we partnered with Dar Jamail to do this film. We reached out to him early on. In fact, we've been talking about this idea for actually maybe like 2 years. Is this how long we've been talking about this idea in general? I think I remember when you were still pregnant is when we really started doing the research for it, which was well over a year ago. And we said we were working on a new film, but we didn't really say what it was. So we've been kind of reading a lot about this, getting resources together, kind of trying to find what organizations are fighting on this issue. But Dar Jamail is one of the people that we wanted to reach out to right away, because he wrote this book recently that's really good called The End of Ice. Ice as in actual frozen water, glaciers, not ice, Immigration's Customs Department, which we want to end. We want that ice to end. We don't want glacier ice to end, which it is. Actually, all glacier ice will be gone in 20 years or something, which is really bad. But Dar not only is like a foremost, very well-known journalist on climate change right now, and is someone who, like, in his spare time goes and like rescues climbers on the glacier or like climbing mountains and stuff. Like, he's a mountaineer guy. Like, he's a rugged, knows the glaciers like the back of his hand, and sees, over the 2 decades he's been doing this, sees the glacier recession. But Dar also is a war journalist. He was one of the first journalists that was in Iraq during the Iraq War. And not only so he knows firsthand the impact of U.S. imperialism. And he was like, a lot of people know now about the impact of depleted uranium on places like Fallujah, where, basically women are told that they should not have children because the birth defects, if the child survives to term, are so horrific. The first story I ever read about that was by Dar Jamail. The first story I ever read about the U.S. Navy conducting war games that were just massacring thousands of dolphins and whales and other types of sea life was from Dar Jamail. And so doing our research, and Dar, I had known him over the years. He was very supportive in working with Iraq Veterans Against the War, just an all-around great anti-war and environmentalist guy. So it was just like kind of perfect, to ask him to partner with us on this. And he agreed, which is great. And so our first, in 2 weeks, actually, coming up quick, 3 weeks maybe, our team, our film crew, and Dar, we're all going to Alaska together. We're going to climb some of these glaciers, and Abby's going to see firsthand with Dar, the changes that he's seen just over the last decade. We're going to be meeting with climate scientists there. And of course, Alaska, one of the things we'll get into is one of the ways the military pollutes, not just carbon emissions, but just dump sites, like toxic dump sites all over the country. Alaska has like 300 toxic dump sites from the U.S. military that just completely destroys the ecosystem, like kills everything that tries to live there. So we're going to be seeing some of that stuff too.
We're going to go visit indigenous communities that are documenting the toxicity of these dump sites. They're called Superfund sites. 900 out of 1,300 Superfund sites in the U.S., which is a designation by the EPA that it is just beyond, like Mike said, I mean, it's uninhabitable completely because of the toxicity. And a lot of this is chemicals, forever chemicals, carcinogens that the U.S. military dumps, and it seeds into the groundwater, and it completely destroys the habitat and pollutes and poisons the communities that surround it. Hundreds of these sites exist in Alaska alone. We're going to visit them. We're going to document them. And also the war games that take place off the coast there. Like Mike just said, whales, dolphins. There's horrific images that we're going to get into in a second. But I want to really quickly comment on something because I know people in the super chat, several comments. One, China. This is what I hear constantly. China, 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 China. Look, China, of course, is the largest contributor to climate change in terms of carbon emissions alone. They have 1 billion people living in the country. There's multiple reasons why they have absorbed most of the pollution, right? The exportation of U.S. capital and production back in the 80s. A lot of this has facilitated the large emissions that China is contributing. The problem is, I'm not a Chinese citizen. I can't do anything about what China is doing to curb carbon emissions. Guess what I can do? As an American citizen, I can spread awareness and try to galvanize people to take action to demilitarize our country and the planet, because we're living in a mass murdering empire that is actually doing incredible destruction and harm to the planet. So that is why, we're not focusing on China here. We're focusing on our military because it is the elephant in the room that no one is talking about. Another comment, climate change. I've a lot of people still don't believe in climate change. Therefore, this is a globalist plot, and that you're wasting your time. You're aiding and abetting this kind of like centralization, power, whatever the fuck it is, power grab. First of all, no one's doing anything about climate change, so I don't know where that is coming from. I wish that the government were actually doing.
Pete Buttigieg just said that we're creating like traffic lanes for electric cars that charge the car while you're driving. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, the boring tunnel system that, oh my God, I can't even handle it. But no, like this whole concept of like, okay, if you don't believe in climate change and you think that it's the solar flares, or you think it's just natural like climate change without contribution from humans, look, can't we all agree that fossil fuels, that excavating like ancient dinosaur fucking blood and bones from the earth is like, first of all, it's not sustainable. Second of all, it pollutes the fuck out of everything. Look at all the goddamn oil spills just on a weekly basis around the country. Like, is that okay? Like just look, even if you don't believe that carbon is being captured in the atmosphere and reflected back on us, which doesn't take much science and research to accept, can't you accept the fact that fossil fuels are extremely detrimental to the environment and humanity at large? Just looking at the transportation and production of oil in general, shouldn't we all be advocating to get off fossil fuels? I don't understand why this is a partisan issue. I don't understand why this has been politicized so much. This is our planet we're talking about here. Third comment before we move on. This is so much broader than the U.S. military. This is about imperialism. This is not just about the U.S. military as an institution. This is about the NATO partners, the junior collaborators with the U.S. empire, and their facilitators, their capitalist enterprises that are polluting around the world. So yeah, you can look at animal agriculture, you can look at fossil fuels, oil companies. All of this is within the system of global capitalism that's perpetuated by U.S. imperialism, hegemony, and domination of the planet. That is the crux of the film. It is so much bigger than the U.S. military. It's the structure and nature of imperialism and why this is just going to drive us into the ground. So, Mike, why don't you continue?
Yeah, and like the film's gonna not make try to argue that climate change. It's gonna start from the standpoint that it's fucking real, and it's actually really bad. And if you're not on board with that, maybe you shouldn't go down the rabbit hole, because it's actually pretty fucking scary. What happens when you go down the climate change rabbit hole. And it's intensely bad, and it makes me very scared for the future. Optimistic about a revolution, I guess, because things are going to heat up, literally. But let's get into some of these different facets that we're going to try to get into in the film, which we hope you support, because we want to shine a spotlight on the U.S. military as a destroyer of the environment. And it's funny because after we announced doing this film, I don't think it's a response to it. It would be funny if it was. But ever since we released our teaser, I've been noticing that the social media of like the Navy and the Air Force in particular, the Army, are doing these like we're like the Army being like, oh, we're helping green the environment, like all this like stuff about changes we're making to prevent climate change, and we're doing our part to save the planet or whatever. It's like, oh, you guys know that you're super fucking guilty and are like preemptively putting this stuff out there because you know it's going to become a bigger issue.
Well, yeah, and what's funny is that a lot of people are in denial about climate change, even in the political establishment.
Right.
But what's interesting, as Mike just mentioned, the Pentagon and the military establishment are already, and have been already, documenting this for decades, acting preemptively to mitigate their, like, the effects for them, right? Not for humanity, but they are basically adapting their plans, acting as if they play no part, of course. This is all about what they're going to do to react to the mass migration, the devastating effects of climate change. And it's just incredible to see the backroom documentation, not even backroom. I mean, this is all articulated in documents that you can actually look at, but this is all laid out pretty clearly. You know, there's no hiding. They know exactly what's going on.
Yep.
This is an inevitable reality, according to them.
Yeah. And, you know, I think just to end on the carbon emissions thing, which of course is a big part of it. Like for example, one B-52 bomber puts out the same carbon emissions as a car driving for 7 years. And so this kind of emphasis on like, oh, go to electric car. Like that's the Biden climate change plan for America, is like more electric charging stations for electric cars or something. Yeah, we got these B-52 bombers literally just flying around for no reason all the time. I mean, they're just always in the air. Nuclear-armed B-52s just popping around, stuff like that. I mean, you know, there's something, having been in the Army, there's something called Motor Pool Monday, where every Monday, every military base, maybe it's just the Army, which is like the biggest branch, but every single Army base, probably the other ones too, every single one in unison, all fires up every vehicle they have, every tank, every Humvee, every MRAP, every armored personnel character, every helicopter, everything. They turn it on and they just let it sit there running because it's your like weekly maintenance that you do. So like to just know that every Monday they're senselessly just turning these things on and just running them for like 4 hours, which already these things like, you know, you couldn't drive them on a road here because you couldn't get approved by the state to like get your carbon emissions check. It's like insane. You know, they get like 3 miles to the gallon, and it's like the carbon emissions are like really, really bad. And they're just fired up, and they're just letting them just. And people that have been in like armor brigade, like anyone who's been in an armored unit in the Army knows that like on Motor Pool Monday there will just be this like black cloud like hovering over the base that day, and like, you know, it makes people sick. It causes a lot of health complications. But just even that alone, it's just like. When you know that happens on one base and then you magnify it like times like 1 million and know that it's just all these bases all over the country, all over the world, like it's just like really, you can kind of hopefully we'll be able to help people really get the scope of all this shit that the U.S. military is churning out. All these bases, you know, the 800 military bases around the world just spitting all this stuff out nonstop. I mean, it's really wild. But
yeah, I mean, this is incredible that you're talking about this because after going on the Joe Rogan show, which people should check out, went on Joe Rogan show a couple of weeks ago, and I got flooded with active duty personnel and veterans that corroborate the thesis of our film, Mike.
Because you brought it up on the show.
I brought it up on the show.
He played the teaser.
Yeah, and this is incredible. I mean, they talked about Motor Pool Mondays, you know, and also this is really fascinating too. Like some guy, and we're going to include this all in the film as well. Some guy was saying that, you know, all the military vehicles just let the gas run out because it's easier than transporting it. And this is not just Motor Pool Monday. Like they literally just drain the fuel tanks and just let them run because they don't want to transport it from one entity to the next. Another guy in the Navy who said that he's going to actually try to film this. The Navy literally just rolls up their trash and dumps it in the ocean. Like, I cannot believe.
Which you don't need to do. The trash is like the containers of like the food and like water bottles that you brought. So if you brought them out, why can't you just bring it back? And like the fact that you just dump it like in the ocean. I mean, we're going to get to the Navy. The Navy is actually the top. That's up there is like the worst of all the branches. But yeah,
it's
like,
such
why?
Callous disregard and so like sociopathic. The fact that this is even happening, like people who are out in the water, you think they would have like a little bit more respect for nature, but no.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something really important, which is that this individualization as the solution. You know, this is a propaganda campaign. This has been a propaganda campaign as long as we've been alive, most of us. That it's all about you. Just recycle, do your part, right? Save water, conserve energy, buy a hybrid car, drink from a metal cup instead of a water bottle. Don't buy a plastic straw, get a paper straw. Like, all of this shit is beaten into our heads to make us burdened with guilt. We're not doing enough. Climate change is this inevitability, this cataclysmic catastrophe on the horizon, and we just have to do more. We have to do more, Mike. It's not about systemic change. It's not about institutional responsibility. No, it's about you. That's the propaganda. And that's what we're going to address. It's the imperialist system. It doesn't fucking matter how many plastic straws are taken off the market. As long as the empire is doing its thing.
Yes. So let's get into some of these different elements that we're going to be documenting in the film.
And also, we accept Bitcoin now.
Oh.
So yeah, the empire@gmail.com. We accept Ethereum, Bitcoin, and also just you can donate through PayPal, credit card, and what else? I mean, just go to earthsgreatestenemy.com on the bottom of the screen if you want to contribute. We're also trying to go to Scotland for the next climate summit.
Yeah, that's coming up in November. So in November, the COP26, this climate summit, there is where they're going to be at this other big meeting of the world powers. We're going to go, as we mentioned, in all the climate agreements, the military is excluded. So there's going to be people mobilizing. It's in Glasgow, Scotland. People mobilizing to go demonstrate, to raise this issue, to say that you have to include the military in this climate agreement. So we're going to be going and covering those protests, but we're also going to be, of course, getting into the climate summit and trying to confront some of these people in person. So that's one of the things we're raising money for, is to get our crew to Glasgow to be able to cover the actual struggle, confronting the people for not including the military in carbon emissions. But let's get into some of these other aspects of how the military destroys the planet in ways that it's never really held accountable for. Let's skip the super fun stuff. We'll go to super fun in a second. Let's go to Dan. If you can go to the first fin whale, and then we're going to show one. We're going to show fin whale, and then fin whale 1, and then fin whale 2. A fin whale is a very cool whale, very big. It's not a blue whale. It's a close relative, but this is an endangered whale. We can go to fin whale 1. There's like, maybe like, I think 30 or 40,000 of these whales. It varies. That one jumping out of the water looks fucking awesome. This thing is like really cool. If you want to see how big they actually are compared to human infrastructure, so you can get a full grasp of the size, go to that picture, and there you go. That is a dead fin whale with its calf that was dragged by a Navy destroyer into a port in San Diego. So this is one of the elements that the naval operations, and the U.S. Navy dwarfs every other navy in the world. It, like, by a lot. The amount of ships that we have, destroyers, aircraft carriers, is really wild, the amount we have. And also we host all these other, I think this is like an Australian ship in this photo here that's docking in a U.S. port, because all of the like junior partners to the U.S. empire, like, we've used them like as surrogates, as proxies, stuff like that. And so, but the naval operations, you can get off the picture because it's very sad, Dan. I don't like looking at that. I'm sure no one else likes looking at it too. You can go back to the cool one. But so the naval operations that are in these pristine and there was a lawsuit threatened by the Center for Biological Diversity, and then the Navy, after, got a bunch of heat in the media, local media in particular, for dragging these endangered whales from their hull. They're like, oh, okay, we won't travel through that, because they were like traveling through like the whale like breeding or like nursery or something. Like, okay, we won't go there anymore because now there's this lawsuit. And it's like, well, how many other places in the world are you doing this? And also, like, you didn't have to go there if you can just be like, oh, never mind, we'll take a different route next time. It's like just the callousness of just plowing through these ecosystems for no purpose. But that's not even, but what's worse is the war games that the Navy does. So, in the teaser, we saw that big bomb exploding in the ocean. Yeah, like the Navy just does that. They're like, oh, let's see.
Like Godzilla.
Yeah, like, let's see what happens if we blow up this bomb in the ocean. And you know what happens is, let's go to this next link. the statement from the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm going to read some of it. All right. The U.S. Navy training exercises in the Pacific Ocean only, could kill, injure, and harass whales, dolphins, and other marine mammals 12.5 million times over the next 5 years. I'm going to read another quote from this. The permits that the Navy took out to do these war games, the permits themselves from the Navy anticipate injuries to 3,346 marine mammals, including 3 endangered blue whales, 20 humpback whales, 10 minke whales, 93 California longbeak dolphins, 46 rhesus dolphins, 3 critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals, and 480 northern elephant seals. You can get off that headline. So when the Navy does operations in war games where they're just blowing shit up, I mean, there's stuff in the ocean. They're not in just like an empty like bathtub in the middle of nowhere. There are sea mammals, and anyone who like watches like cool nature documentaries, like, you know, if you're a David Attenborough head, you know, if you've seen all the Attenborough stuff, I mean, you know that every piece of a chain of an ecosystem, every piece is important. Like the dolphins, like the poop of the dolphins, all these little planktons eat, and then everything eats the plankton. It's like, it's a life cycle. You know what I mean? It's like, everything is so, nothing is not important when you have very delicate and fragile ecosystems like the deep ocean, which is like extremely important to the earth. And the Navy just goes and just blows a bunch of shit up. And it kills a lot of stuff. When it doesn't kill, it injures it, messes it up. And like it does so many other things that just make it impossible for like little fish to survive or like to ward off predators. Like it's really, really damaging. And this is just one example. Like the statement is anticipating these war games. I mean, they do this off the coast of Alaska all the time. And the naval war games are like really, really messed up. But that's just one aspect. We hope to document them. And we actually, for this film, we're already in the process of trying to get interviews with military officials, because we'd like to ask, you know, a Navy commander about blowing up all the dolphins in the ocean.
Yeah, and speaking of just fragile ecosystems and destruction of habitats, we hope to travel, if we get funding enough, to go to Jeju Island and the Okinawa Island in Japan and Korea. So these are 2 base struggles that the entire community is opposed to the ongoing construction of U.S. bases. Okinawa is essentially one giant military base. There's like, I don't even know how many fucking military bases there are. That's actually what generated my anti-imperialism in college, was finding out about just Okinawa alone. It's very shocking. But Okinawa hosts a blue coral reef that is completely unique in its biodiversity. Anywhere in the world, the only one. And they're just fucking paving it over to build this military base. And then you have Jeju Island has what is that term called? The geoparks, which is just a unique habitat that is specialized biodiversity that exists nowhere else in the world. So it hosts, I don't know, like multiple geoparks, and there aren't many in the world either. So we really want to focus as well, you know, outside of the U.S., of course, on the demilitarization struggles, the people who are fighting day in and day out, the elders of these communities who are resisting U.S. militarism, and document that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But before, so yeah, that's like there's so much outside of the borders of the U.S. empire. Like the bases just cause so much destruction. But to get those specifically are ones that are literally just digging up important ecosystems in the ocean. But anywhere that there's a base, which the U.S. has a lot around the world, the toxins that come out of it just kills people and kills all life around it. And so we're going to get into some examples of that, just what happens in the U.S. And once you see what the U.S. military is willing to do to its own people, its own soldiers, families of soldiers that live near military bases, once you're willing to see what they do there and how they will lie and cover it up, then you can get an idea of what they're willing to do dumping on communities all across the world that aren't, you know, their own people.
And this, I mean, this is like obvious, but it's like, we're not even talking about the effects of war. You know what I mean?
That we'll
it's
get
like,
into
this
also,
is,
yeah.
I mean, we don't even need to get into that here. We're obviously going to get into it in the film, but it's just like, if you guys are watching this live stream, it doesn't need to be articulated, the damage and destruction that war causes. Just look at the depleted uranium in Syria and Iraq. So with that in the back of your mind,
Agent Orange, people still dying
and
from...
the deforestation and agricultural
Japan.
destruction. I mean, it all feeds into this, right? The uninhabitability of being able to sustain life in any of these arenas. So back to your point, let's look at just a couple examples of what the U.S. military has done here to poison its own citizens, its own veterans that it claims to hold in such a high regard.
So, Dan, let's watch Coldwater Creek first. The little 2-minute video, pretty short.
The inviting currents of Coldwater Creek,
there's something very wrong,
wind through miles of North County neighborhoods, parks, and schools.
Why are all these people in North County sick?
Carrying a legacy of nuclear waste.
Roughly 15 people that I know of that I've found over the past couple of months.
Just in this neighborhood?
Just in this neighborhood.
Karen Nickel, who has an autoimmune disease, can't believe how many of her classmates and childhood neighbors are getting sick.
I don't want my kids or any other kids to end up like me.
About 2 years ago, Janelle Wright and several of her class of '88 McClure North High School friends started wondering why so many of their peers were battling cancer.
Where it got to be suspicious was when we had 2 friends that were diagnosed within a few months of each other with appendix cancer, and both people were told that that's a 1 in a million cancer.
Wright, an accountant and former auditor, started collecting data from her classmates. Soon, peers from neighboring schools reached out too.
On Facebook, this just took off like wildfire. People started reporting their cancers and then autoimmune diseases.
At first, there were 30 cases. Within 2 months, she had data on 200. Now, her maps have 700 cases in 4 square miles, including 62 brain cancers, 27 cases of leukemia, 26 cases of lung cancer, 24 cases of multiple sclerosis, 15 cases of lymphoma, 10 cases of pancreatic cancer, and 3 cases of conjoined twins. Wright became equally alarmed when data showed some of her classmates' children had serious medical problems too.
We're seeing odd things like several children have had to have their thyroids removed before they were 10 years old.
Strange coincidence, or was something else at play? Another classmate is...
You know what it was? Something else that was at play was the U.S. military. That's dumped from the U.S. military, putting their waste in the water because they don't give a shit. They're not regulated. Even like corporations don't have a lot of regulations, but the military has less regulation than the corporation. All those people died because of U.S. military dumping. And there's been a fight. I mean, that's an old video. The military just lied and covered it up. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Studies are inconclusive. I mean, this is what they do. And they're like, oh, well, we're going to fund a study to study the effects. I mean, this is what they do. And then they'll pour $50 million into their own study that'll take 20 years so they can say, oh, yeah, we didn't find anything. So that's an example of a Superfund site.
No, because it's the same thing. The nukes are, the nuclear waste is the Coldwater Creek. So,
sure. Yeah. So that's just one example of, that's nuclear waste that is there. But of course, there's other types of.
Oh, yeah. So in Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina.
I have a video too for that.
Oh, cool. There's a degreaser chemical. Oh, okay. You have a video for that. Great.
Let's watch one other thing called Baby Heaven.
Mary Blakely was walking this lonely section of Onslow Memorial Park when she came across a tiny tin plaque. It read simply, Baby Girl Ward. Blakely had found herself in Babyland.
These are my peers. I'm a Marine Corps brat. And this could be me.
From the 1950s until the 1980s, Blakely and other residents of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, drank and bathed in water laced with toxic chemicals. Chemicals linked to childhood leukemia, birth defects, and several rare forms of cancer.
More people were exposed, maybe up to 1 million people, some at incredibly high levels of toxic exposures to chemicals such as trichloroethylene. So there's nothing else like that I'm aware of in the history of this country.
The Marine Corps says cleanup of the contaminated wells is nearly complete, and the water is tested monthly.
It's probably the safest and most tested drinking water that they can find.
The government is offering health care to victims, but many questions remain.
It's been at least a 2-decade-long story, which is not complete, not finished yet.
And neither is Blakely. She started digging and came up with 2,500 death certificates, all babies with a connection to the base during the 30-year period. She shared her findings with federal health authorities.
Where are their markers? And who's told their parents that these children didn't die because of anything that they did? They were poisoned.
Blakely hopes a long-delayed report on birth defects and childhood cancers at Lejeune will help shed light on the full scope of the contamination. She has already glimpsed the heartbreaking toll in.
So this is particularly infuriating because, and it should be to all active duty, military people or veterans, because this is just an extreme example, a very common example rather, of the deliberate poisoning of people, in this case, a Marine Corps base for decades. All of these babies dying, baby heaven, because there was such a rampant death of children and babies and miscarriages. And then denying. They said in the report that there was medical care given. Okay, that was that happened for like a year or two. And then ever since then, they've just denied all claims. So it was a very specific short time, I think, during Obama, that they're like, okay, we're finally going to appease some of these cases, these decades-long appeals to get health care that, by the way, people are still suffering from that live in the area. And so then they denied it, just like the first responders of 9/11. They dribbled and drabbled a couple cases of people who were sick and dying from the toxic dust cloud, and then they shut the valve off. And so all these people are dying with no health care because they're fucking chewed up and spit out by the U.S. government. That's how much the U.S. government gives a shit about veterans and its own people. They are all guinea pigs, as we all are, right? And a perfect example of this is this clandestine burning. Oh, sure.
Yeah, so before we get into this next example, but the two videos you just watched are two Superfund sites from the U.S. military. Those are two.
Mm-hmm.
There are about 900 other places exactly like that in the United States alone that have been designated by the EPA. There is hundreds more that the EPA hasn't designated yet, that are toxic dump sites from the U.S. military that could become designated as Superfund sites that also are killing people in the same exact way. So that's a pretty big scandal in our opinion, and we hope that becomes a big part of the film, which is going to require us traveling to these different locations, hear the kind of stories you heard here. But there's so many cases that just haven't been known because there are so many. I mean, there's probably over 1,000 places like these two examples that you just saw. And that's just Superfund sites in the U.S. That doesn't count all of the different types of, that's just Superfund sites. There's so many more ways that the U.S. military pollutes within its own borders also, which is the story that Abby's going to talk about next.
Yeah, 900 out of the 1,300 Superfund sites are either active military installations or have previously housed military needs. So just imagine, wrap your mind around just how big that problem is here in the U.S., and they denied this. They denied all of this. They actually actively covered it up and falsified data, just like in Flint, and they still are denying it to this day.
They spent more money trying to hide it than they could have just spent to compensate the families and fund a cleanup.
And these are forever chemicals. In terms of the Coldwater Creek video that you watched at the beginning, this is a carcinogen that has a shelf life of like 1 billion years. It's a nuclear waste.
Right. The sun will explode before that stuff goes away.
Yeah, it really upsets me. Okay, so we're almost done here, guys. Thanks for sticking with us. We know it's late for people all over the world, or all over this country, rather. I'm like, so good morning to those. Sorry, I'm tired. Woke up very early. Okay, so let's wrap this up by talking about the toxic chemicals that the U.S. military is clandestinely burning. Hundreds of sites across the U.S. The U.S. military is actually burning aqueous firefighting foam. Of course, it's happening in low-income communities.
Burning firefighting foam.
Okay, so this is insane. So this is another forever chemical. So this foam was created, I think, during the 80s or something like that. It was meant to actually curb fire. It was actually created to actually stop fire, right? So the fact that they are trying to get rid of the foam by lighting it on fire is extremely counterintuitive and
It's a very
insane,
Army
right?
thing to do.
Yeah, so they basically want to get rid of this foam. They don't know how to do it, so they're just trying to incinerate it. Extremely insane, does not make any sense. And here's the problem, is that it's a forever chemical. So even if you incinerate it and manage to somehow get rid of the foam, even though the whole point of it is to stop incineration, those chemicals never go away. They permeate into the air, they permeate into the soil. So, and they are linked to a range of carcinogens, developmental disorders, cancers, immune dysfunction, and infertility. So it's just insane. I mean, this is something that's happening now. This isn't a remnant of the Cold War or World War II, like Coldwater Creek. This is happening right now. The military is still doing this shit every day. And this was only just found out about recently. So, yeah, I mean, take it away, Mike. I'm too mad to continue.
Well, I mean, they can do it because they're just going around to low-income neighborhoods to burn the chemicals. I mean, that's something else to wrap your mind. I'm just like, of course, environmental racism plays a big part in all of this. But literally, like, it's almost like an X-Files episode. Like it's a secret government operation to, for some reason, burn this foam. I don't know why, which just makes no sense
put
anyway.
It in a fucking warehouse or
but
something.
So they're like,
why?
okay, so we gotta burn this foam for some reason. So we're gonna sneak in. We're gonna like dress all in black and like at night sneak in all these low income neighborhoods of color and just burn them off and then pretend that we were never there. This like is like a CIA operation. It's honestly like some shit that you would see on X-Files, and it just shows the kind of callous disregard for public health and for the planet, because this stuff just is going to go into the atmosphere instead of being in the ground or whatever. So there's so many other facets to this that we're not going to get into because it's getting late and we appreciate everyone sticking with us. But the thing that we want to end on in terms of how the U.S. military poses the greatest threat to the planet than anything else, which is a thesis that we will stick to, nuclear weapons alone. Of course, we talk about the production of nuclear weapons, nuclear waste. People are still dying every day from the nuclear waste, from creating nuclear weapons. But the existence of nuclear weapons poses a threat to all life on Earth. There was a study that was done in 2006 that I found in my research, and it concluded that nuclear weapons pose, quote, the single biggest threat to the Earth's environment. And the reason for that is, if there was even a small-scale nuclear war, if there was a war, and if there's a World War III, there's a high likelihood that there will be a small-scale nuclear war, that some nuclear warheads would be used in a World War III type situation. This study found that the detonation of just 0.03% of the nuclear arsenal, which is about 50 nuclear weapons of various sizes, tactical warheads, things like that, that would throw enough soot into the atmosphere to create a cataclysmic environmental disaster. The ozone layer which protects us from the sun's radiation.
Maybe that would help us with climate change.
Right. No, everyone would die of radiation poisoning. If you didn't die from radiation poisoning from the nukes, you'd die from radiation poisoning from the sun, because we would have no more ecosystem. It'd be like the asteroid hitting the Earth. And so like the tens of millions of people would die just from the climate ramifications of a small scale nuclear war. And I think people normally think of like, oh, a small scale nuclear war. Well, that's never going to happen. I think about who the U.S. government is.
Yeah, think about what we just talked about.
Yeah, like, look at who's in charge of this fucking place. Look at the shit that they've already done around the world. Like, it's completely, I mean, the U.S. almost dropped like 20 nukes on China, like in the 50s. I mean, they've had plans to drop large amounts of tactical nuclear weapons, specifically on China, which is where the biggest danger lies. Because if you think it's really unreasonable to fear that a nuclear war is possible, it is very possible, because the United States is on a war path. It is on a trajectory of just global hegemony, that it doesn't care what it has to do in its belligerence to be the world hegemon, to take out rising powers like China and Russia. We talked about earlier in this live stream, Kamala Harris is in Asia right now trying to create conflict with China. As I mentioned too, sources inside the military saying everything's turning towards war with China, great power confrontation. That's what all the cadets at West Point University, all the elite military schools are preparing and training for confrontation with China, with Russia. But war is become intentional. Like, it doesn't mean that Biden or President Harris or President Trump again in 4 years or whatever is going to say, oh, I want to start a nuclear war with China. But just wars happen without there being intent, like just belligerent, just escalation of actions, causing a war that nobody intended to have happen. But just because the U.S. acts in such a belligerent, menacing manner could accidentally set off a war that the U.S. then escalates quickly into a nuclear war. And then the climate change debate is over because they drop some nuclear weapons. And then all of a sudden we're in like a dark winter because of the use of these. And so just the existence of nuclear weapons on this planet is an abomination. To know that 0.03% of the nuclear weapons that exist could end most life on Earth, could create a climate catastrophe unlike anything we've ever thought of. It's just like, why do they exist? Like, why do it's just horrific.
And we're investing like $1 trillion on like the nuclear arsenal and just continue to build them up, because as Brian Becker talked about in the recent socialist program, is that all of these think tanks it's just constantly generating new policy prescriptions about why we need more nukes, you know, because it benefits them. And it's just crazy. It's like there's never any discussion about actually we need denuclearization. It's always, no, we need more because China's doing this and Russia's doing that. And mostly it's just a reaction to our belligerence and our escalation. But it's just fascinating when you see how the policy plays out with the think tanks and all that. So yeah, it's truly stunning. What you just outlined is absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
Nukes, baby.
That's right.
Let's change our whole documentary to just be about nuclear weapons now.
Well, yeah. Our friend Travis Wilkerson just made a film called Nuclear Family that I think just came out, where he tours a lot of these things. So I'm excited to see that. Everyone should check that out too. But just to wrap up this thing about film, if you donate on the website, earthsgreatestenemy.com, or if you become a patron, you're going to be getting update. When we go to Alaska, we're going to be sending exclusive updates to the people that have been donors, video and photos and what we've been doing, updates on what's happening when we go to the UN summit. All of, like, if you donate, you'll become part of the journey with us as we're going, visiting these super fun sites, all this stuff. You'll kind of be brought in on like the inside. So that's why I encourage people to do that. If you sign up on our Patreon too, like, this live stream is only going to be available to the public for like 24 hours, and then it becomes locked for patrons only, just like all the previous live streams we've done. So if you're not a patron already, you can access those archives,
and I know
patron-only podcasts.
I know Mike mentioned earlier that we're going to be focusing solely on this for the next 6 months to a year, but we obviously are going to also produce constant podcasts and video reports as often as we can. So if you become a patron, we're not just going to go dark for 6 months. We are very cognizant of the output, and we want to continue to be up to date on all the things that are going on in terms of our foreign policy and the rotting empire here at home. So please support our work, because we really are, we're really conscious about providing that cutting edge analysis about all the stuff that's going on.
Just to shout out some super chat people, I can't get to all of them. I really appreciate it, but Dan Values, thanks for being the first one before we even started the stream. You threw us a super chat. Thank you. Trish, as always, we love you. Thank you so much. Again, for Juan Lopez and David Rydell, thank you so much for the big boys there. Cameron, we miss you. Hope to see you soon. JB, King Kamishiro, Kay, thank you for the big donation. Johnny Boy, thanks for just dropping them in randomly throughout to get your little emojis on there. We love seeing it throughout. And Timothy McDermott, wish we could answer your question, but we do not have time, but thank you for that. And Mona Izadi and Kay, again, thank you very much, all of you. You're making this work possible. The travel we're about to do, extremely expensive. Like, we have to pay like $3,000 just to go see this one glacier. So it
definitely adds up. This Alaska trip is going to be a doozy, but it's all going to be worth it, because we're trying to expose the most important topic, which is the U.S. military as the largest polluting institution and a huge contributor to climate change. And we need to refocus our efforts on this. We need to focus our organizing against the U.S. empire and also for demilitarization in all of our communities. And it all links together, really, all the struggles. And that's why we really appreciate your support. And let's give a shout out to
the
Dan.
reason our live stream looks so slick and that we're able to do it, and why we're going to be able to do more in the very near future, is because Dan Simpson is helping us out. So Dan, if you want to pop on and say hi and see where people can find your work where you're in front of the camera and not behind it pushing the buttons.
Yeah, it's me back here. Really good to be here. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I'm so stoked to get to rep my my alma mater, Failed State U. Please check out my live Twitch stream. I do a little curious, wholesome, chill leftist, I call it an edutainment live stream, just about every day, right there on the twitch.tv/iDanSimpson. That's my name. We do anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. Every now and then we'll share an Empire Files video and everything. So we do the news and the politics and the memes live every day. Come check it out, twitch.tv/iDanSimpson. Thanks so much.
Great, Dan. Where can people find you on social media too?
So you can find me at Shy Johnny Cash, CHI Johnny Cash, because they banned my other Twitter account. You know how it goes.
Yeah. Did you encourage George W. Bush to do self-harm, which is what I got recently?
Ironically, it was only a few months ago that they wanted me to do a stream with Karl Rove, and I had to turn him down. So, yeah, I prefer these kinds of streams.
You got.
Yeah, no, you're amazing, and if people are interested in hiring you, and I know you are,
wizard with the OBS stuff.
Yeah, you're a wizard with OBS. And, dude, I want one of those sweatshirts, man. I want to rep Failed State. That's great.
I'll drop the link in the chat. How about that? It's thecolacorporation.com.
Well, drop your Twitch in the chat too for people, because that
will do.
Yeah, every Empire baby is already repping the Failed State here. So thank you so much, Dan, for sticking with us. You were awesome. It really pimped out our entire live stream. We really appreciate you, and thank you so much for everyone for your support, for sticking with us, for all your comments. We're looking forward to hearing from you. If you have any inside information about the military, about pollution, to corroborate our thesis, please email me at theempirefiles@gmail.com.
Bye, everyone.
Peace out, guys.